The ER doors didn't open. They exploded. Three men in tactical gear hit the entrance of Mercy Hollow General Hospital at 11:47 p.m., and the first thing they did was shoot the security camera above the front desk. The second thing they did was press a gun to the charge nurse's temple and ask where room 14 was. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. In the back of the ER, a woman in blue scrubs looked up from a medication chart. She was 29 years old, 5'4", and had been told twice that week she wasn't cut out for emergency medicine. Her name was Dana Kelso. She watched the men fan out across the waiting room, and her face went completely still, not with fear, but with something older and much more dangerous than fear. She set down the chart, quietly, like she had all the time in the world. If this story already has you gripping the edge of your seat, follow along to the very end. Hit that like button. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night had started badly before it got worse. Dana had been on shift since 3 in the afternoon, which meant she'd already survived 8 hours of Dr. Marcus Vell. That alone was an achievement worth noting. Vell was the kind of physician who walked into a room and immediately made it smaller. 46 years old, head of emergency medicine at Mercy Hollow General, with a jaw built for condescension and the habit of repeating himself whenever he thought someone hadn't fully absorbed how right he was. He had been repeating himself at Dana since her first week. Kelso. He said her name the way people say the name of a wrong answer. What exactly is your clinical rationale here? She had flagged a patient, Mr. Arnie Tusk, 61, presenting with what the intake form called indigestion, but what Dana's gut said was something cardiac. She'd ordered a troponin panel and an EKG without waiting for Vell's sign-off because the patient's color was wrong, and his left arm had that faint tremor she'd seen twice before in her life, both times in people who were 40 minutes from a myocardial infarction. His diaphoresis started after he sat down. Not before, she said. He said the pain radiates to his jaw. The intake form says indigestion, but he's a 61-year-old male with a BMI of 32, and he's been stress eating since his wife left him in March. I want a troponin. Vell looked at her the way you look at something that has crawled onto your shoe. He's anxious. His O2 sat is 96. I've been doing this for 22 years, Kelso. When I want a first-year nurse's interpretation of a patient presentation, I'll ask for one. I'm not first year. You're a floor nurse covering ER overflow because we're short-staffed, which means you are categorically out of your depth and categorically not in a position to be ordering panels on your own initiative. He pulled the order tablet from her hand with a calmness that was worse than anger. Send Tusk home with antacids and tell him to follow up with his GP. If you have trouble with that instruction, I suggest you take it up with the nursing coordinator, who will confirm that unilateral diagnostic ordering is not within your scope. She wanted to argue. She had enough data points in her head to build a case that would have held up in any reasonable conversation. But she had learned, recently, and at some cost, that Marcus Vell did not have reasonable conversations. He had performances, and the audience was always himself. She went back to Tusk's room alone. He was a big man made smaller by the gurney, with thick hands folded over his stomach and eyes that kept drifting to the ceiling like he was waiting for someone to give him permission to feel worse. His daughter sat in the plastic chair beside him, her coat still on, her phone dark in her lap. They sending me home? He asked. Not yet. Dana checked his pulse manually instead of just trusting the monitor. 72, but irregular in a way the machine wasn't catching. Mr. Tusk, I want you to be honest with me. That pain, where exactly is it? Here. He touched his sternum, then slowly slid his hand toward his left shoulder. But it's probably nothing. Marcus, the doctor, he said, I know what he said. She kept her voice level. I'm asking what you feel. He looked at her for a moment, and then his eyes got wet in the way old men's eyes get when someone finally just asks them the right question. It's been there since this morning. I thought I'd slept wrong, but it keeps squeezing. She nodded. Okay, I'm going to get you some aspirin, and I'm going to stay close. If anything changes, anything at all, you press that call button. You understand? You're not supposed to be doing this, are you? His daughter spoke up, not accusing, just reading the room. I'm supposed to take care of patients, Dana said. That's the job. She went directly to the medication station, pulled 325 milligrams of aspirin from the cabinet, and logged it under a symptom management notation that was technically accurate and technically not the same thing as ignoring Vel's instructions. It was the kind of move that lived in the gray space between protocol and conscience, and Dana had learned to live in that gray space like she'd been born there. 40 minutes later, Arnie Tusk's troponin came back elevated. Not from an order she'd placed, from the standing overnight panel that ran automatically on any patient who'd been in the department more than 2 hours. The system had caught what Vel had dismissed, and Dana was at the nurse's station when the result flagged and the monitor lit up red. She was also the one who caught Vel before he could quietly revise the chart. His troponin is 0.82, she said, stepping in front of him in the corridor with the printout in her hand. That's a STEMI. Vel took the paper. His jaw tightened, just slightly, but she caught it. I see that. He needs to go to the cath lab. I'm aware of the protocol, Kelso. You sent him home with antacids. He's still here, isn't he? Vel's voice dropped, which was worse than when he was loud. Because I chose to keep him for observation, which is why the panel ran. It was a lie so smooth it had been prepared in advance, which told her this had happened before. She opened her mouth, and then behind her the charge nurse called out that bed 3 was coding, and the moment collapsed into movement and noise. And Dana spent the next 40 minutes doing compressions on a 73-year-old stroke victim while Vel stood at the foot of the bed calling orders he hadn't needed to give because she was already doing them. By 9:30, Arnie Tusk was in the cath lab with 2 arteries blocked, and the cardiologist on call cursing under his breath because another 40 minutes would have meant a different outcome. By 9:45, Dana was in the break room drinking cold coffee and staring at the wall. The resident, a second-year named Felix Bray, stuck his head in. He was young enough to still be embarrassed on other people's behalf. You okay? Fine. Vel's telling people you were out of line with the Tusk orders. I know. Are you worried about that? She looked at Felix, who had good intentions and no spine yet, which was probably fixable over time. Not particularly, she said. He's going to write you up. He was going to write me up anyway. He wrote up the last 3 nurses who questioned him. She finished the coffee. The patient's in the cath lab. That's what matters. Felix lingered in the doorway for a second longer than was comfortable. You're different from the other nurses. Different how? He thought about it. Like you've seen something worse than Vel before. She didn't answer that. She put her cup in the sink, pulled her hair back tighter, and went back to the floor. That was at 9:45. At 11:47, the doors exploded. The first indication that something had gone wrong was the sound. Not the gunshot, which came second, but the impact of the doors themselves, which were heavy pneumatic things designed to withstand gurneys at full speed, and which opened with a crash that vibrated through the walls of the entire south wing. Dana was rechecking Tusk's replacement chart when she felt it more than heard it, and she turned toward the noise before anyone else in the corridor did. 3 men. Tactical vests, no insignia, 2 with sidearms drawn, one with something longer slung at his back that she cataloged without looking directly at it. They moved like people who had rehearsed the space, which meant they had floor plans, which meant this was not random. The charge nurse, Patrice, 52, 20 years on the floor, the kind of woman who handled everything, said, "Hey," and then the one nearest her put a gun against her head and said, "Nobody talks, nobody moves. Where is room 14? Room 14 was a private recovery bay used for post-surgical overflow. It was occupied tonight by a single patient who had been admitted under a name Dana hadn't recognized, a name that had appeared on the census with a notation she hadn't seen used before in a civilian hospital. The notation read, "Restricted access. Coordinate with administration." She knew, in that instant, what the notation meant. She had seen its equivalent before, in a different context, a different life, and the recognition landed in her chest like something cold and heavy. She took one breath, one full, deliberate breath, the kind she had learned to take a long time ago in circumstances she did not discuss. And then she began moving, not toward the men, not toward the exit. She moved laterally behind the nurse's station desk, where the overhead lighting was slightly worse, and the sightlines from the entrance were broken by the medication cart. She moved in the slow, slightly hunched way of someone who is scared, and trying to make themselves small, which was exactly what she wanted them to see. Around her, the ER was doing what crowds do in sudden violence, freezing, then fragmenting. A waiting room patient bolted for the far exit and was grabbed. 2 residents backed into the trauma bay doorway. The hospital's internal phone system began a low, repeating alert tone that nobody was at the desk to answer. Patrice was still at gunpoint. She was not crying, which Dana noted with something close to gratitude. Patrice was the kind of person who did not cry in front of people who were doing this to her. "Room 14, the man repeated. He was the tallest of the 3, with a voice that was almost conversational, which was the most frightening kind. "Last time I ask." One of the residents, Dana didn't see which one, pointed down the corridor. She watched the 3 men begin to move and made her own calculations quickly. 3 visible. Probable support outside, at least 1 on the entrance, possibly 2. The building had 4 external exits, 2 of which were alarmed. The patient in room 14 was the target, which meant they needed him alive, or they needed something he had. And either way, they were not going to leave clean. That meant everyone in this ER was a liability. She reached under the nursing station desk, not for the panic button, which had already been hit, she'd confirmed by the alarm tone, but for the trauma shears in the supply drawer that she'd left there this morning when she'd been too busy to put them back in her pocket. She closed her hand around them and moved. Dr. Vell materialized from the direction of the doctor's lounge, which meant he'd been getting coffee when the doors blew and had taken 30 seconds longer than everyone else to understand what was happening. He appeared in the main corridor in his white coat, holding a mug, looking at the armed men with the expression of someone who believed the world still operated on a system in which his coat meant something. "Excuse me, he said. "This is a hospital." The second man hit him across the face with an open palm, not a fist, but hard enough to stagger him. And Vell went sideways into the wall, coffee going everywhere, mouth open in shock that was almost comical, except that nothing about this was. Dana turned away from him. She needed him out of her head. She was in the corridor now, moving in the direction of room 14, but staying against the wall, using the recesses of doorways and the bulk of the laundry cart someone had abandoned mid-shift. She could hear the men ahead of her, 2 of them, because the 3rd had stayed back at the entrance. The corridor was lit in the way of overnight hospitals, which is to say inadequately, which was, right now, useful. She reached the junction 15 feet from room 14's door and stopped. She could see through the small window in the door that the patient inside was conscious. He was a man in his 40s, lean and gray-faced, with the particular stillness of someone who had trained themselves not to show pain. His left arm was in a pressure bandage that the nursing staff had applied on admission. He was looking at the door. He had heard them coming. She had approximately 4 seconds before the men reached the room. She spent 2 of them running the scenario. The door opened inward, which meant whoever entered first would have their back to the hinges for a half-second before they cleared the frame. The corridor behind her was clear for now, but not for long. She did not think about whether she should do this. She had stopped thinking that way a long time ago. She thought about timing, positioning, and what she was willing to break. The first man reached for the door handle. Dana moved from the doorway recess, and she was already behind him when his weight committed forward, her left forearm going across his throat from behind. Not a choke, a guide. Leveraging his own momentum to drive him off balance, while her right hand caught his gun hand at the wrist and bent it inward with a sharp, specific rotation that produced the sound of something giving way and the gun clattering to the floor. She took him down hard against the wall, his knees buckling, and the second man was already turning. She stepped over the first man, pivoted low, and hit the second under the elbow with the heel of her hand, driving the arm up and his aim toward the ceiling before he could register what was happening. He was bigger, and he recovered faster than she'd calculated. He grabbed for her coat and got a fistful of it and yanked, and she let him pull while she stepped into him instead of away, which was not what he expected, and the close distance meant the gun was useless, and she headbutted him once at the bridge of the nose, felt the cartilage give, and he went down holding his face. 7 seconds. Both men were down. Neither was dead. She hadn't wanted them dead. She wanted them subdued long enough to get the patient in room 14 to somewhere the third man at the entrance couldn't reach. She pushed into the room. The patient was already trying to sit up, which told her his pain tolerance was either trained or chemical or both. "Don't," she said. "You'll open the wound." He looked at her. His eyes were dark and very clear despite the gray color in his face, and he said, "Who are you?" "I'm your nurse," she said. Let's go." "There's a third." "I know. We're going through the supply corridor." She hit the bed brake, checked the IV line, still viable, and began moving the bed toward the secondary exit that connected room 14 to the supply corridor behind the south wing. The man tried to help push. She let him, because there wasn't time to argue, and because part of her wanted to see how much he had in him. Behind them, she heard shouting. The man she'd taken down first had found his voice. The supply corridor was service-lit, yellow-white fluorescence buzzing over bare concrete, and it smelled of industrial cleaner and the particular staleness of a hospital's infrastructure. She moved the bed fast. The IV pole clattered against the wall at the first turn, and she caught it without slowing. "Keycard," she said. "Supply access C is at the end." "I don't have—" She already had hers. Staff keycard, worn around her neck since the start of her shift, tucked under her scrub collar where it had been for 8 hours. She swiped the reader at the supply access door, and it opened and she pushed the bed through. The room was full of equipment shelving and 2 crash carts that hadn't been restocked yet. It was cold. There was 1 chair, a wall-mounted phone, and no windows. She braked the bed, checked the patient's bandage. The movement had started a slow seep through the outer dressing, and pulled supplies from the nearest shelf: gauze, compression wrap, tape. "Hold still," she said. "You need to call someone," the man said. "I have—" He stopped. Swallowed. His color was worse. "There's a drive. Evidence. It's on my person. I'll get to that." She layered gauze over the existing dressing and began wrapping. Her hands were steady in a way that had nothing to do with being calm and everything to do with practice. "What's your name?" He hesitated for exactly 1 second too long, which was its own kind of answer. "Harrison," he said. "Reed Harrison." She looked at him. He looked back. Something passed between them that was not quite recognition and not quite suspicion, and sat uncomfortably between the two. "That an alias?" she said. "It's on my chart." "That's not what I asked." He watched her hands on the dressing and didn't answer. The wall phone rang. She picked it up. It was Patrice, which meant Patrice had gotten free, which meant the situation at the front of the ER had changed. "Dana?" Patrice said, and her voice was shaking in a way it hadn't been with the gun at her head. "There are more of them. 2 more just came in through the ambulance bay." 5 total, then. Possibly more outside. "Is the alert still running?" Dana said. "Police are 6 minutes out. The system auto-called when the panic button hit." "Anyone hurt?" "Dr. Vell's got a split lip. The waiting room patient they grabbed has a cut on his arm. Nothing. Nothing serious yet." Patrice paused. "Dana, what's happening? Who is that man in room 14? Dana looked at the patient. He was watching her with that same clear, careful attention. "I don't know yet," she said. "Keep everyone in the trauma bay. Lock the internal doors. Don't let anyone go looking for me." She hung up. The patient, Harrison, or whatever his name was, had closed his eyes while she was on the phone, not from unconsciousness, but from the effort of managing pain without showing it. She recognized the look. "The drive," she said. "Where is it?" He opened his eyes, reached with his good hand to the underside of his left thigh, where the hospital gown gapped at the edge of the mattress. There was a small adhesive pocket there, the kind you could buy at any camping supply store, or the kind that got issued. He peeled it open and took out a drive the size of his thumbnail. "What's on it?" she said. "Everything." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I can give you right now." He held the drive out, and she took it. "The people who sent those men, they've been using hospitals, moving things, covering their tracks inside medical facilities because medical privacy law makes it hard to audit. Someone found out." He paused. "Someone tried to stop them." "You." "Not just me." She turned the drive over in her hand. It was light. "Who else?" He looked at her for a moment, with an expression that shifted through several things before settling on something she couldn't read. "What did you do before this?" he asked. "Before nursing." She put the drive in her scrub pocket and looked at the door they'd come through. "I did other things," she said. In the corridor beyond the supply room, she could hear footsteps. More than 2 sets, moving in the organized way that people move when they're searching, not panicking. Someone had organized the 2 new arrivals and put them on pattern. She counted the footsteps. 4 men, moving in pairs. Not the same group as the first 3. These were better trained, more deliberate, which meant whoever had sent them had escalated, which meant the first 3 hadn't been enough, which meant they knew the first 2 were down. She looked at the crash carts. She looked at the supply shelves. She looked at the door to the secondary stairwell at the back of the room. Harrison was watching her. His face was still gray, but his eyes were sharp. "You're not just a nurse," he said. She said nothing. "Blue badge," he said quietly, like he was testing the weight of it. The sound of it hit her somewhere behind the sternum, and she went completely still for exactly 3 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than she could afford. Then she looked at the door. "We need to move," she said. They moved. Dana took the lead, one hand on the bed's rail, the other flat against the supply room door she'd just cracked 2 inches to listen through. The footsteps in the corridor had paused. Not gone, paused, which meant one of the pairs had stopped to check a room and the other was still moving. She counted the gap between footfall patterns and put the stationary pair at roughly 40 feet north, the moving pair closer to 30 and closing. She let the door fall shut again without sound. "Stairwell," she said low. "Can you stand?" Harrison was already swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The movement pulled something in his shoulder. She saw it in the set of his jaw, the brief whitening around his mouth. But he didn't make a sound, just got his feet on the floor and held the bed rail until the room stopped moving. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not," she said, already pulling the IV line free of the port with one hand and capping it. "But fine enough. Come on." She got his good arm over her shoulder. He was heavier than he looked, which was the case with men who were built for function rather than appearance, and the first 2 steps were ugly. He found his footing on the third. They went through the back of the supply room to the secondary stairwell door, which opened with a push bar that she hit with her hip. The stairwell was concrete and cold and smelled of dust, and it went up 4 floors and down 2. She took him down. The basement level of Mercy Hollow General was a maze of maintenance corridors, electrical rooms, and the kind of institutional infrastructure that nobody thought about until something broke. Dana had spent 3 weeks during her hospital orientation memorizing the building layout, which her supervisor at the time had called excessive, and which she had called necessary. She knew the basement connected to the east parking structure through a utility tunnel that ran under the ambulance bay. She knew the tunnel had a manual override lock on the hospital side that could be engaged from inside without a key card. She also knew there was a security substation at the bottom of the stairwell that was usually unmanned on overnight shifts. Usually. She pushed the door at the base of the stairs open 6 inches and looked through. The substation was lit and the monitor bank was running, and sitting in the chair in front of it, zip-tied to it with his own belt, was the overnight security guard, a man named Ordell, who was 24 and had been working this post for 7 months, and who Dana had chatted with on exactly 2 occasions, once about the coffee machine on floor 3 and once about his brother's truck. He was conscious and unhurt and looking directly at the door with an expression of focused desperation. One of the attackers was standing 3 feet behind him, scrolling through something on his phone. Dana let the door close. "One guard down there," she said quietly. "One of them in the room with him." Harrison leaned against the stairwell wall. The color in his face had not improved. "How do you want to do it?" "I want to not do it," she said. "But we need that tunnel. Give me something to work with." She looked at him. He was upright, which was better than she'd expected, but his left arm was held at an angle that meant he was protecting the shoulder whether he knew it or not. And his breathing was the careful, measured breathing of someone managing a pain level they weren't going to admit to. "You're not working with anything," she said. "Stay here." She took off her lanyard, keycard, badge, 2 pens, and looped it over the stair railing. Then she straightened her scrubs, ran a hand over her hair to smooth it, and pushed through the door like she belonged there, which she did. The man with the phone looked up. She was already moving, posture loose, face slightly panicked, one hand pressed to her chest in the way of someone who had just come from something bad and hadn't fully processed it. "Oh, thank God," she said, which was the kind of thing a frightened civilian nurse would say, and her voice was slightly breathless in a way that cost her nothing. Are you security? There are men upstairs. They have guns. I heard shots." He started to stand up from where he'd leaned against the console, and she was already past the threshold. And when he reached out to stop her forward momentum, she caught his extended wrist with both hands and twisted it backward over itself, while her foot hooked his ankle, and he went down faster than a man of his size had any reason to expect from a woman in blue scrubs. His head met the edge of the console on the way down, not hard enough for serious damage, hard enough to stop the conversation. He was on the floor, dazed, and she had his phone and his radio in her hands before he'd figured out what had happened. She crossed to Ordell and pulled the belt loose from the zip ties. They'd used his belt to secure him, but the ties themselves were cheap, single-use plastic, not the reinforced kind, and she broke them at the join with a sharp lateral pull. He stared at her. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yeah." His voice was rough. "Yeah, I can walk, Dana." "Come with me." She went back to the stairwell door and pushed it open. Harrison was where she'd left him, still upright, eyes tracking. "Clear," she said. "Tunnels this way." Ordell saw Harrison and registered the blood on his shoulder dressing and went a particular shade of pale. "Who is he?" "Patient," Dana said. "What?" "Not now." She handed Ordell the radio. "If this comes on, don't respond. Just listen. We need to know where they are." The tunnel under the ambulance bay was low-ceilinged and lit by strip lighting that hummed in a frequency designed by no one and tolerated by everyone. The floor was slightly damp near the midpoint, where a pipe had been repaired twice and not quite fixed. Donna kept her hand on Harrison's arm and her eyes on the end of the tunnel, which was a door with a push bar and a small window. Through the window, the east parking structure's ground level. Dim, half empty. No movement she could see. She pushed through. The structure smelled of motor oil and the particular cold of cement that never quite warms up. She moved Harrison to the shadow of a support pillar and leaned him against it and looked back at the tunnel door, where Ordell was coming through with the radio clutched against his chest. "Palihi?" she said. "Dispatch says 4 minutes." He checked his watch with the expression of someone who doesn't trust the estimate. "They called a tactical unit because of the weapons." "How long for tactical?" "They didn't say." She looked at Harrison. He had his eyes closed, which she didn't like, and she put 2 fingers to his wrist and counted. Pulse was elevated, but not dangerously. His shoulder dressing had a wet spot the size of her palm. Not immediately critical, but the category could change. "Stay with me," she said. He opened his eyes. "I'm here." "The drive. What formats the evidence?" "Documents, financials, recorded calls." He shifted, and the movement cost him. "Transfer records from 12 hospitals. Mercy Hollow is on the list." She looked at him. "On the list of what?" "Facilities being used to move restricted materials and launder federal medical grants. The patient billing system runs cover for it. Someone inside each facility coordinates." He paused. "The person coordinating here carries physician privileges, high enough to access everything, trusted enough that nobody audits them." She sat with that for a moment. "Vel," she said. Not a question. Harrison didn't confirm it and didn't deny it, which was a kind of answer. The radio crackled. She put her hand over Ordell's and the sound muffled. A voice came through anyway, speaking in the flat, compressed tone of someone using a secure channel. "Third floor clear. No subject. No package. Fan to recovery wing." They were regrouping. The 2 pairs upstairs had lost them and were redirecting. "They'll check the stairwells," she said. "Then the basement." "How long?" 3 minutes, maybe less." Ordell was looking at her with an expression that had passed through frightened and arrived somewhere she couldn't immediately name. "How do you know all this?" he said. "How do you know how they move? How they—" "Dana, you're a nurse." She looked at him steadily. "I'm your nurse tonight, Ordell. That's what you need to know." He shut up, which she appreciated. What she did not say was that the voice on the radio had used a term she recognized. Package. Not patient, not subject. Package. It was a specific piece of operational vocabulary that meant specific things in specific contexts and the fact that these men were using it meant they weren't private contractors pulled together on short notice. They were organized and they were sourced from somewhere with training standards, which changed the calculus in ways she was still working through. She pulled out the drive and turned it over in her hand again. Something was bothering her about it. Not the drive itself, but the size of what Harrison had described. 12 facilities, financial records, recorded calls, the kind of evidence that took months to compile. "How long have you been building this?" she said. 14 months? Alone? Mostly. Who sent you to Mercy Hollow? He looked at her with those dark, clear eyes. Someone who owed me a favor. Someone who said if it went wrong, there was a contact here who could get the evidence out. He paused. They didn't give me a name, just a location. She waited. They said look for the nurse, he said, who doesn't belong. Something cold moved through her, and she folded it flat before it could become anything she'd have to manage. That's not specific enough to mean me. No, he agreed. But here you are. She put the drive back in her pocket. The radio crackled again, this time 2 voices overlapping, and she caught one word before Ordell muffled it, basement. They were 40 seconds ahead of her estimate, which meant someone had thought of the tunnel. We need to go up, she said. The parking structure has an exit to... We need to go back in. She stood and looked at the tunnel door. They're going to find the man I put down in the substation. When they do, they'll know someone who can fight is in the building, and they'll change how they're moving. Right now, they're still looking for a scared patient. I want them to keep looking. Ordell stared at her. You want to go back in. I want the evidence to get out, she said, which means I need to be where it has the best chance of being handed off. She looked at Harrison. Can you move? I moved the last 200 yards, didn't I? Barely. I can do barely again. She made a decision she knew was going to be uncomfortable to explain later. She looked at Ordell. I need you to take him to your substation backup, the one on the 2nd floor south, not the basement. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone until you hear 3 knocks, then 2, then 1. Do you understand? What are you going to do? I'm going to give them something else to look for. Ordell opened his mouth. 3, 2, 1, she said. You'll remember that? He nodded, jaw tight. She turned back to Harrison. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have time to analyze. The drive stays with me, he said. The drive goes with you, she said. Because if something happens to me, it still needs to get out. If something happens to you... She reached into her pocket, pulled the drive, and held it out. When he took it, she closed his fingers around it. There's a second copy. He went still. You made a copy. When you were managing your pain in the supply room, I used the wall terminal to upload the file partition to the hospital's secure external backup server. She met his eyes. Takes about 90 seconds. I had 4 minutes. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief, and landed somewhere closer to the expression of a man recalibrating entirely. Who are you? He said again, but different this time. Go, she said. 3, 2, 1. She turned and went back through the tunnel. The basement was empty when she came back through. She moved fast through the maintenance corridor and hit the service stairwell going up 2 floors and came out on the 2nd level in a different wing of the building than she'd left from. The hospital was very quiet in the specific way that it gets when people are hiding rather than sleeping. A held breath quality to the air, rooms dark or barely lit, the kind of silence that has the shape of people in it. She found the first one of them in the east corridor by the rehabilitation unit, where he'd stopped at the nursing station to check the census board. She watched him from the stairwell door, held it open half an inch, and counted 1 man, sidearm holstered, radio in his left hand, head down over the census printout. She thought for exactly 2 seconds about what she was going to do. Then she walked out of the stairwell into the corridor, in the open, at a pace that was just barely fast enough to suggest urgency without panic, and said loudly, Oh, there you are. My patient, room 14. Patient. He went down the east stairwell 20 minutes ago. I was trying to find someone to... He looked up. What? The patient from room 14. He got out of his room. I've been looking. He was already on the radio, which is what she needed. He'd moved 2 steps toward her to hear better over the static, which closed the distance. And when she got within arm's reach, she went under the radio with her left forearm, knocked it against his chin hard enough to make his teeth snap together, and hit him with the heel of her right palm at the side of the jaw. And he sat down on the corridor floor with the expression of a man who has been informed very suddenly that the evening is no longer going the way he planned. She took his radio and his zip ties, nice ones, reinforced, and used 2 of them on his wrists before he could get his bearings back, then pulled him into the supply closet 6 feet down the corridor and locked it from the outside with a furniture wedge she found under the nurse's station desk. 3 down, at least 2 more somewhere in the building. The radio in her hand hissed, and then a voice said very clearly, "Package has been moved. Kelso." She stopped walking. They knew her name. She stood in the corridor of the 2nd floor of Mercy Hollow General Hospital, holding a radio she'd taken off a man she'd just put in a closet, and processed what it meant that these people, organized, well-sourced, using operational vocabulary, had her name. Not the patient's name, not the nurse. Her name. Which meant the information predated tonight, which meant someone had identified her before any of this started, which meant the 14 months of Harrison building his case had somehow circled back to a thread that led here, to her, to a hospital where she had been the least remarkable person in every room she'd ever walked into. The radio hissed again. Kelso was the contact. Confirm. She turned the volume down to almost nothing and kept moving. Whatever she had thought she was doing tonight, whatever the clean version of this was, protect the patient, hold the line, wait for the police, she could see it changing shape in real time, becoming something wider and more complicated and significantly more personal. The men in this hospital weren't just here for Harrison's drive. They'd known she was here. They'd sent enough people to handle both. She reached the south corridor and took the stairs up to the 3rd floor, where through the wired glass of the stairwell door she could see Vel. He was standing at the end of the 3rd floor hallway, not hiding, not crouched, but standing upright with his white coat and his split lip and his arms slightly away from his body, in the posture of a man who was waiting rather than frightened. He had his phone in his hand, and he was reading something on it, and standing 5 feet from him, not threatening him, not restraining him, was one of the men with tactical gear. They weren't facing each other. They were standing side by side, looking at the phone screen together. Dana stayed behind the door and watched for 11 seconds. That was all she needed. Vel said something she couldn't hear through the glass. The man in tactical gear said something back. Vel nodded, typed something on his phone, showed it to the man who looked at it and spoke into his radio. She took her hand off the door handle. There it was. Not a suspicion anymore. Not a theory built on the notation on Harrison's chart or the way Vel had tried to walk back Tusk's results, or the way he'd appeared when the doors blew, looking more inconvenienced than afraid. She had watched him stand with one of the men who had put a gun to Patrice's head, sharing a phone screen, and whatever was on that screen was something they both needed to be looking at right now, at midnight, in a hospital under siege. She sat with it for exactly as long as she could afford. Then she heard, distantly but unmistakably, the sound of police sirens, close, getting closer. And then the sound that came right after. Not relief, not the sound of the building relaxing, but the sound of boots on the floor above her moving fast toward the west end of the building, which meant whoever was up there was not waiting to be found, which meant someone had given a signal to pull back, which meant Vel was looking for the stairwell. She moved to the door. She got there just as he did. He pushed through from the 3rd floor side at the same moment she came up from the 2nd, and they were 2 feet apart in the stairwell landing, and for a half-second they just looked at each other. His face had the particular expression of a man caught in a gap between roles, the physician's authority draining out of it, something else trying to fill in. "Kelso," he said. "Dr. Vel," she said. His eyes went to the radio in her hand, then to her face, then to the stairwell exit above him where he'd been heading. "I need to get to the roof," he said. "For the helicopter. The medevac. They're trying to—" "There's no medevac," she said. "The alert system would have flagged it." He stopped talking. "I saw you," she said. "3rd floor corridor." You want to tell me what you were showing him? Something happened in his expression that she'd never seen there before in all the weeks of being dismissed and talked over and managed out of her own clinical observations. The condescension left. What replaced it wasn't guilt, wasn't panic. It was something cold and very deliberate, and it was worse than either. "Move," he said. "No," she said. He took a step toward her, and the sirens outside the building got suddenly louder, and then there were voices at the base of the stairwell below them, not tactical voices, not the clipped exchanges of men with radios, but the specific, loud, identifying, layered command voices of police making entry, and the door at the bottom burst open with the bang of a hard push, and a flashlight beam swung up the stairs and found them both. "Freeze, police! Hands where I can see them!" Vell's hand went into his white coat pocket. Dana moved without thinking about it, purely on the calculation that she was not going to let anyone in this stairwell get shot tonight, and she had his wrist out of the pocket and bent backward before his fingers could close on whatever was in there. He made a sound, sharp, almost surprised, like a man who still didn't believe what was happening, and she held him and looked down the stairwell at the officer with the flashlight. "Nurse," she said, "Dana Kelso, the patient is safe. This man needs to be detained." She waited one beat. "There's a phone in his right coat pocket. You're going to want to look at what's on it." The beam held on her face for 3 seconds. Then more officers came through the door and the stairwell filled up fast, and someone had Vell's arms and someone else had her by the shoulder, steering her gently but firmly against the wall. And the radio she was still holding was taken from her with a brief apologetic glance from a young officer who looked like he was 19 and was probably 26. She let herself be moved. She kept her hands visible and her breathing even, and she let the night catch up with her for exactly the 30 seconds it took them to establish she wasn't armed and wasn't a threat. And then she said, "There's a patient on the second floor south, room in the security backup station. He needs a surgeon and he needs federal protection on him tonight. The evidence he's carrying is connected to federal charges, and it needs to be handled by someone above the local level." The officer holding her arm said, "Ma'am, I know how I sound," she said. "I know, but I need you to listen to me." He listened, and she told him just enough. What she did not tell him, what she kept folded flat and quiet in the part of her that had been folded flat and quiet for years, was what the voice on the radio had said. Kelso was the contact, not a nurse who got in the way, not a civilian complication. A contact. Someone identified in advance, someone known, which meant someone who knew her knew what she'd done before Mercy Hollow, knew what she'd been, had put her name in the middle of this operation as a piece of the puzzle, not a bystander, and that someone was not Harrison, because Harrison had been sent here by a favor, and favors came from people, and people had names. She was standing in the stairwell with police around her, and the sound of the building slowly coming back to life, voices, footsteps, the distant sob of someone in the waiting room finally letting go of the fear they'd been holding, when it came to her. Not all the way, not the whole shape of it, just the edge, the notation on Harrison's chart. Restricted access, coordinate with administration. She had assumed it meant the hospital's administration, standard protocol for a sensitive patient. But the word coordinate had a second use, a procedural use, a use she'd last seen inside documents she wasn't supposed to have read, and had read anyway, a long time ago, when she was someone else and the stakes were someone else's stakes. Coordinate meant there was a handler, and if there was a handler, there was a chain, and if there was a chain, the men who'd come through those doors tonight were not the top of it. She was still working through what that meant when the stairwell door above her opened and a man came through it, who was not a police officer and not an attacker and not anyone she had seen in this building tonight. He was wearing a suit that had been expensive before it got wet in what looked like rain outside, and he was in his 50s, and he had the particular stillness that she associated with a very specific kind of professional. He looked at her the way you look at a thing you have been waiting for. "Ms. Kelso," he said, "my name is Garrett Lund. I'm with the Defense Intelligence Agency." He paused. "We need to have a conversation about why your name is in the operational file of a man who's been dead for 6 years. Dana looked at Garrett Lund for 3 full seconds before she said anything. The stairwell was crowded. 2 officers still beside her, another one up a half flight watching the landing. And Lund had come through all of that like it wasn't there, which meant he'd shown credentials that moved people, which meant the suit was current, not a cover, which meant the Defense Intelligence Agency was not learning about Mercy Hollow tonight. They'd known. They'd been moving. "Which file?" she said. Lund glanced at the officers. "Gentlemen?" Just the one word, and the officers looked at each other and then found reasons to be slightly farther away. "Which file?" she said again. "Operation Cartilage," he said. "Okay." "Which file?" she said again. "Operation Cartilage," he said. "Closed 6 years ago. Your name is in the contact registry for an operative named Miles Voran." He watched her face carefully. "You knew him as something else." She had not heard that name in 6 years. The specific weight it put in her chest was not something she'd been prepared for, which was its own kind of information about how well she'd convinced herself she was done with it. "Voran was listed as deceased," she said. Her voice came out level, which cost her. "He was listed as deceased because we listed him that way," Lund said. "It was protective cover. It stopped working about 8 months ago when someone with access to the closed file started pulling threads." He paused. "The man in your security station right now, Harrison, was one of Voran's assets. He didn't know Voran was alive. He was working the hospital network case on separate tasking, but when his operation started connecting to cartilage infrastructure, someone drew a line between the dots and found your name at the intersection." She looked at the floor for a moment, not because she needed to think. She was already thinking, had been since the radio said her name, but because she needed to not be looking at Lund's face while she decided how much of this to take at face value. "Who drew the line?" she said. "That's what we're working on." "That's not an answer." "It's the most honest one I have right now." He reached inside his jacket and produced a thin credential case, opened it, held it where she could read it. DIA identification, current issue. Name, Garrett Lund, Senior Operations Officer, Domestic Liaison Division. The photo matched. "I came through the east entrance 12 minutes before police made entry. I've been waiting for the building to stabilize." 12 minutes, she said. "You were here while you were handling it," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. "You watched." "I assessed." He held her gaze without flinching, which she didn't respect but understood. "I needed to know what I was working with. You needed to know if I was a threat. I needed to know if you were compromised." He put the credential case away. "You're not, which means we can move forward." One of the officers at the base of the stairwell called up. "Ma'am, we need you to come down and give a statement." 2 minutes, Lund said, without looking down, and the officer stopped talking. Dana let out a slow breath. "The drive Harrison's carrying connects to 12 facilities." 14, Lund said. "He didn't have the full count." Vel is one of the inside coordinators. Vel was recruited 22 months ago. He has a gambling problem that somebody used. Lund's voice carried the flat, clinical tone of a man reading from a report he'd memorized. "He's not the architect. He's a node." "Then who's the architect?" Lund's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. "That's why I need you to come with me." She stared at him. "I have patients. I have staff who've been through—" "I know." He said it simply, without dismissing it. 20 minutes. "There's someone upstairs who needs to see you specifically. In this building." "Room 412, he said. "Came in through the roof 40 minutes ago. Hasn't been able to do much else." She went still. 4th floor was post-surgical. 412 was a corner room she'd passed twice in the last week, doing overflow coverage. It had been empty both times. "Who?" she said. Lund said a name she had not heard in 6 years. Pasinu. The 4th floor was quieter than the rest of the building, which had begun the slow, disorganized process of returning to function. Police radios and voices, the gradual reopening of locked doors, someone crying in a room on the 2nd floor with a sound that had the quality of relief rather than grief. The overhead fluorescents up here were fully bright, and the corridor had the particular antiseptic stillness of a unit where everyone was either sedated or exhausted. Dana went ahead of Lund. She did not want him walking beside her right now because there was a conversation she needed to have with herself about what she was walking toward and she needed the 3 seconds of corridor between them to have it. Miles Varan was the name Lund had said. She had known him for 11 months during a period of her life that was not in her personnel file and was not in her nursing school transcripts and was not in anything that existed in a searchable form outside of a classified archive that she had signed her name to closing. He had been her operational handler during 2 field assignments she did not think about in the daylight, and she had believed for 6 years that he was dead because she had read a file that said so and had chosen to believe it because the alternative, that he was alive and hadn't told her, was something she'd decided not to carry. She pushed the door to 412 open. The man in the bed was older. That was the first thing. Older than she'd expected in a way that 6 years didn't fully account for. There were new lines in his face, and his hair had gone more gray than she remembered, and his left hand, resting on top of the blanket, had a tremor she didn't recognize. His right arm was in a sling. There was an IV in the crook of his left elbow, running saline, and the monitor beside the bed showed a heart rate of 61 and blood pressure that was lower than she would have liked. He opened his eyes when she came in. "Dana," he said. "You're bradycardic," she said. "Your pressure's low. What happened to your shoulder?" "Hello to you too." "What happened to your shoulder?" He looked tired in the way of someone who has been managing pain for longer than tonight. "Came in through the roof hatch. The ladder was shorter than the schematic suggested." "You fell." "I landed harder than I planned. There's a difference." She crossed to the monitor and looked at the numbers properly. His blood pressure was 94/61, which wasn't immediately dangerous but wasn't comfortable either, and the heart rate suggested either a vasovagal response to the pain or something she needed to rule out. She checked the IV rate. Someone had set it at 75 milliliters per hour, which was reasonable but not aggressive. She turned it up to 125. "I don't need—" "You do," she said. She checked his pupils. Equal. Reactive. Checked his color. Better than Harrison, worse than it should have been. "You're hypovolemic. Did anyone look at the shoulder?" "Someone put a bandage on it." "That's not the same thing." She found the supply cart someone had left near the wall, which still had a basic assessment kit on it from whenever this floor had last been active. She pulled on gloves. "I'm going to look at it." He let her, which told her the pain was worse than he was showing, because Miles Varan didn't let people touch him when he had a choice. The shoulder was dislocated. Not fractured, she could tell from the positioning and the way he'd been protecting it. But the joint was out of socket in the posterior direction, which was less common and more painful than the standard anterior presentation. And whoever had put the bandage on it had missed this entirely because they'd been treating for bleeding rather than structure. "This needs to be reduced," she said. "Now?" "In about 4 minutes," she said, "after I ask you some questions." He looked at her with an expression that she remembered from a long time ago. The look he used when someone was doing something he hadn't accounted for in his planning. "You're angry," he said. "I'm working," she said. "Tell me about cartilage." He told her. Operation Cartilage had started as a financial crimes investigation, federal medical grant fraud, the kind that happened at scale when someone figured out that hospital billing systems were complex enough to hide things inside. What it became was something larger, a network that used medical facility infrastructure for the physical movement of restricted materials, components, not finished products, small enough to travel inside supply chain shipments that carried customs exemptions under medical necessity codes. 14 hospitals across 9 states. The materials were defense adjacent. The people who wanted them were not supposed to have them. Voren had been running a source inside the network for 3 years. The source had gotten too close, too fast, and someone had noticed, and Voren had been burned. Not killed, burned, which meant his cover identity had been flagged, and he'd been pulled and filed as deceased to protect the source who was still inside. That source was Harrison. "He didn't know you were alive," she said. "No. He thought he was working alone." "For the last 14 months, yes." Varan shifted, caught himself, controlled the wince. "He didn't know we were aware of his operation. We let him run because he was getting deeper than we could have managed officially. When he went to Mercy Hollow, we knew the timing was critical. We knew someone would come for him." "You knew they were coming and you let him—" "We had assets positioned." "You had me positioned," she said, And there it was, the thing she'd been sitting with since the stairwell. My name in the contact registry. Except I didn't know I was in any registry. I left. I was done. You were never fully out, Voren said quietly. Not because we kept you in, because of what you know, who you are. The people who run this network. They did their research. They found the connection between you and cartilage before we knew they'd been in the file. She looked at him. So they came here to get Harrison's evidence and to deal with me. Yes. And you came here to make sure you had what you needed, he said, and to give you something. He reached across his body with his good hand, the left, awkward, obviously not his dominant side, and took an envelope from the nightstand. He held it out. She took it. Inside was a single page. Printed, not handwritten. A name and a title and a series of numbers that she recognized as a federal classification code. The name was Admiral Desmond Farr. She had heard the name. Everyone in the building she'd worked in 6 years ago would have heard the name. Farr was Joint Chiefs adjacent, not on the chiefs themselves, but in the tier just below. The kind of position that had real operational influence without the visibility that came with the top chair. He had been in that position for 9 years, which was unusually long for the tier, and she had never paid specific attention to him because he had not been relevant to anything she'd worked. He's the architect, she said. He's been running this network since before cartilage identified it, Voren said. He has the clearance to access the medical facility exemption codes. He has the relationships with the contractors who move the materials, and he has the authority to classify anything that starts getting close to him. Including you. Including me. He paused. He's the one who flagged my cover identity. He's the one who authorized the team that came here tonight. She set the paper down on the nightstand. Her hands were still in gloves. She needed to reduce the shoulder and she needed to think, and she needed to do both in the next few minutes because downstairs, Lund was going to run out of ways to hold the police statement process at arm's length. The evidence on Harrison's drive, she said. Does it touch Farr directly? Enough to open a formal investigation, not enough to convict. What would be enough? A second source, someone inside the network who can testify. He looked at her. Or someone with access to Farr's classified communications who can show the authorization chain. She looked at the classification code on the page, then back at him. You have it. I have part of it. He held up his left hand, tremor visible. I've been accessing a restricted archive for the last 4 months. I was close, but I needed someone with clinical credentialing to access one specific set of records. Medical authorizations that Farr routed through the hospital network to give the materials movement legal cover. They're filed under patient data protection. I can't pull them without triggering an audit flag that would burn the whole operation. He looked at her steadily. You can. She absorbed this. That's why my name was in the registry, she said. Not a question. Not as a field contact. As an access point. I was going to bring you in properly, he said. I was going to explain it. When? When I had more time. The words came out with something that might have been regret, but was probably closer to the operational version of regret, which was disappointment in a variable that hadn't resolved the way the model predicted. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Arnie Tusk and his slow squeezing chest. She thought about Patrice with a gun at her temple, not crying. She thought about Ordell in the basement, trusting a 3-knock sequence because she'd asked him to. She thought about Marcus Vell standing in a corridor at midnight, reading a phone screen beside a man with a tactical vest. Where are the records? She said. Mercy Hollow's patient data archive, he said. Server room, sub-basement. They're filed under a facility code that routes to a federal clearinghouse, PHX-7 designation. You have clinical access. If you pull the records flagged under that code and route them to the external backup server you already used tonight, I can pull them from the federal end before anyone knows they've been accessed. She stared at him. You know I uploaded to the backup server. Lund told me 10 minutes ago. Lund was watching the whole time. We needed to know if I was compromised, she said. Yes, you said. She pulled the gloves off. I'm going to reduce your shoulder now, and it's going to hurt, and you're going to hold still. She did not give him time to prepare. which was intentional and which she felt approximately 10% guilty about. She repositioned the joint with a scapular manipulation technique. Hands on the blade of the scapula, controlled rotation, steady lateral traction on the arm, and the joint went back with a sound she felt more than heard, and Voron made a single sharp noise that he cut off immediately. She checked the positioning. Good reduction. She fashioned a proper sling from a pillowcase and the triangular bandage on the supply cart and secured it. "Better?" she said. "Yes," he said, through his teeth. "I'm going to the sub-basement," she said. "I need 10 minutes, and I need Lund to keep the police occupied." "He can do that." She moved to the door, then stopped. "Miles." She hadn't used his name yet tonight. He looked up. "After this, I want the full file. Everything. My name in every registry, every designation, every operation I was adjacent to that I didn't know about. All of it." He held her gaze. "That's a fair ask." "It's not an ask," she said, and left. The sub-basement was one floor below the maintenance level, accessible by a single elevator or a utility stair that required a facilities keycard. Dana had a facilities keycard because she had been covering overflow shifts across 3 units for the past 6 weeks, which meant her access level had been expanded by the nursing coordinator without anyone thinking much about it. Nobody thought much about what nurses could access. She took the utility stair. The server room was at the end of a short corridor past the electrical junction and the backup generator housing. Behind a door with a biometric reader that accepted her thumb because the clinical staff credentials had been enrolled into the server room access log 2 months ago, when the hospital upgraded its digital record infrastructure and someone in IT had been too broad with the permission rollout. She knew this because she had noticed the access log update and mentioned it to the IT liaison, who had said he'd look into it and had not looked into it. At the time, she'd thought it was sloppy administration. Right now, she was grateful for it. The server room was cold and loud with cooling fans and lit in a blue-white that made everything look clinical in the wrong way. She found a terminal, logged in with her clinical credentials, and pulled up the patient data archive. PHX7 designation. She searched the facility code. 43 records came up, all filed under patient privacy protection, all with admission dates spanning the last 22 months. She opened the first one. It was structured like a standard patient record, demographics, admission notes, treatment plan. But the treatment codes were wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way. Wrong in the way that a record looks correct until you have clinical training, and then the procedure codes don't match the diagnoses, and the billing entries reference supply requisitions that don't exist in the hospital's physical inventory. And the authorizing physician's signature on 2 of them was from a doctor who had left this hospital 14 months ago and would have had no reason to be signing Mercy Hollow records after his departure. The signature was Vell's predecessor, a doctor named Alton Reese, who Dana now remembered had left abruptly, and whose departure had been described to her, in passing, by Patrice as a whole thing. She began downloading. The external backup server route, she'd used it once tonight already, which meant the pathway was warm. She routed the 43 files through a bulk transfer, watched the progress bar, and stood very still in the cold, loud room while it ran. 31 seconds. On the 17th second, the door behind her opened. She turned. Marcus Vell was standing in the doorway of the server room. He was not in his white coat anymore. It was gone, along with the physician composure. And what was left was a man in a rumpled Oxford shirt with blood on the collar from his split lip and eyes that had lost the performance quality entirely. What was behind them was not guilt. It was the particular calculation of someone who was still trying to find an exit. "You can't send those," he said. She looked at the progress bar. 21 seconds. "They'll charge me with everything," he said. "I brought them the access. I gave them the billing codes. I didn't... It was supposed to be paper movement, paperwork. They told me nobody was getting hurt." "Arnie Tusk almost died tonight," she said. "You delayed his diagnosis by 2 hours. That wasn't connected." "No," she said. "That was just you being a bad doctor. The rest of this is being a criminal." She turned back to the terminal. 26 seconds. "Kelso." He stepped inside the room. "If you send that, I lose everything." "You lost it when you said yes to whoever recruited you." I had debts. I know about the gambling, she said. I know how they found you. It doesn't change what you did with it. He was across the room in 4 steps and his hand came down on her arm, pulling her back from the terminal, and she let him pull her 1 step before she turned and planted her feet and shoved him back into the server rack with a flat palm to the center of his chest. He hit the metal housing hard, caught himself, and looked at her with the expression of a man finally confronting the distance between what he'd assumed and what was true. 31 seconds. The transfer completed. She heard it, the soft confirmation tone of the terminal, and held Vel's gaze while it registered in him. His face went through several things in quick succession and settled on the emptiness that comes after adrenaline when there's nothing left to fight. It's done, she said. He sat down on the floor of the server room. Not violently, not dramatically. He just stopped holding himself up and sat down against the server rack with his legs out in front of him, and he put his face in his hands, and he made no sound at all. She left him there and walked back up the utility stair. Lund was waiting at the top. He had his phone in one hand and a look on his face that was something she associated with people receiving confirmation they'd been waiting on. Transfer came through, he said. How much do you have? Enough for a federal warrant. More than enough for FAR to know it's over. He looked at her steadily. He's going to find out what happened here tonight within the hour. The people he sent have been detained or they've pulled back, and either way he's going to know the operation failed. And when he knows, Lund paused. He has options. He has a lot of connections. People at that level. He's going to run, she said. We don't think. He's going to run, she said again, flat, certain. He has a protocol for this. Everyone at that level who does what he's been doing has a protocol. He built 14 months of cover, Lund. He built it inside federal medical infrastructure. He has an exit plan. Lund looked at his phone, then looked up, and his expression confirmed it before he spoke. He's not at his residence, Lund said, as of 43 minutes ago. She stood in the corridor of Mercy Hollow General with the cooling fans loud below her and the sound of the building above her coming back to life. And she looked at Garrett Lund, and she thought about a man who had been running a network inside the medical system for years and who had enough clearance to classify anything that got close to him, and who was now, at this moment, 43 minutes ahead of wherever they needed him to be. Where's Harrison? She said. Still in the security station. Take me to him. Why? Because 14 months ago, Harrison started pulling threads from inside FAR's network, she said, already moving toward the stairwell, which means he knows what the threads looked like from the inside, which means he knows where they go. She pushed the door open. And because Miles Voron is in a room on the 4th floor with a freshly reduced shoulder and an IV drip, and access to a restricted archive he's been building for 4 months, and I think between the 3 of us we can put together a picture of where a man like Desmond Farr goes when everything falls apart. She was 2 steps into the stairwell when Lund's phone buzzed. She heard him answer it. She heard the shift in his voice from careful to something that was not quite alarm and was not quite composure. Wait, he said. She stopped. Farr isn't running, Lund said slowly. He looked up from the phone. He's coming here. She held the door. Why? Because there's something in this hospital he hasn't recovered yet. Lund's voice had gone flat in a way that meant he was processing something he didn't want to say. Something that wasn't on the drive, something that wasn't in the server records. He looked at her. Something he put here himself 2 years ago, when this all started. The stairwell was cold. The fluorescents buzzed. Somewhere above her, the hospital was recovering from a night it didn't fully understand yet. And somewhere outside, a man with the clearance to make federal problems disappear was driving toward the building she was standing in. What did he put here? She said. Lund's jaw tightened. He looked at the phone, then at her, then said the thing he clearly didn't want to say. A witness, he said. Someone he needed to keep quiet and keep close. Someone who's been here for 2 years under a different name. He paused. Someone who can place Farr at the beginning of all of this and testify to it in federal court. She waited. The witness is a patient, Lund said. A long-term patient admitted under a psychiatric hold that Farr arranged personally. He looked up. Her real name is Reese. Mara Reese. He watched Dana's face. She's the wife of Alton Reese, the doctor who had left 14 months ago, the doctor whose signature was on the false records, the man who had, apparently, not left by choice. Dana stared at Lund. "She's been here the whole time," she said. "Third floor," Lund said. "Room 307. She has been a patient at this hospital under falsified psychiatric documentation for 26 months. The door handle was cold under Dana's hand. She held it and thought about a woman who had been inside this building for over 2 years, while the man who put her there ran a network through its billing system. She thought about what it would mean for Farr to come back for her now. She thought about what it meant that nobody, not the staff, not the patients, not the nurses who covered third floor, had known what they were looking at. She thought about how many people in this hospital, on any given shift, were looked at without being seen. "He's not coming to run," she said quietly. "No," Lund said. "He's coming to make sure she can't testify. We have officers on the building. How many of those officers know which patient she is?" Lund's silence was its own answer. She was already moving up the stairs. She took the stairs 2 at a time. Third floor was the one she knew least well. She'd covered it twice, briefly, for overflow, and the layout was in her head as a rough geometry rather than a detailed map. Psychiatric unit was at the north end, behind a secondary badge access door, separated from the rest of the floor by a corridor that functioned as both buffer and checkpoint. The door required a different credential level than her general clinical badge. She didn't slow down when she reached it. She badged through on the clinical override that had been part of the broad IT permission rollout, the one the IT liaison hadn't gotten around to fixing. It beeped and opened, and she went through. The psychiatric unit at this hour was dim, overnight lighting, the kind designed to be non-stimulating, and the nurses' station at the center was staffed by a single person, a night shift nurse named Bev, whom Dana knew only by face and the fact that she brought homemade food on Saturdays. Bev looked up with the startled expression of someone who had spent the last hour hearing things she couldn't explain and had chosen to stay at her post because it was her post. "Room 307, Dana said. "Mara Reese, I need to see her now." Bev stared. "Visiting hours are not what this is," Dana said. "Is she in her room?" "She was at last check, 20 minutes ago." Bev reached for the internal phone, which was the right instinct, the by-protocol instinct. "I should call the attending do it while you walk with me." Bev hesitated for exactly the span of a breath, and then stood up, because Dana's voice had the quality of someone who has already moved past the point where hesitation is useful, and nurses who work overnight psychiatric units develop a specific sensitivity to that quality. They went together down the corridor. Room 307 was the third door on the left. The observation window showed a bedside lamp on low, a chair with a folded blanket. Dana pushed the door open. The bed was empty. The blanket was on the floor. The window, which was on an upper floor and was supposed to be sealed, the standard psychiatric unit sealed window spec, had its locking mechanism forced, the safety lever bent at an angle that required specific knowledge of how it worked. Bev made a sound. Dana went to the window and looked down. Third floor was 30 feet above the hospital's exterior courtyard, which was paved and had 2 benches and a planted border that served as the psych unit's outdoor access point during daytime. There was a figure in the courtyard below, standing, not running, standing very still near the far wall. And there was another figure with them that was not a patient, not staff, not a police officer in any configuration she'd seen tonight. She looked for 4 seconds, establishing what she needed to. "Call Lund," she told Bev. "His number is coming from the officer at the main desk. Tell him courtyard access, north side, right now." She left before Bev could respond. The courtyard access stairwell was through a fire door at the end of the unit corridor, 3 flights down, opening onto the courtyard through a push-bar exterior door. Dana went through it at a run and came out into the cold, which hit her face like a correction. She'd been inside too long. The courtyard was maybe 50 yards across. In the middle of the night, it was lit only by the perimeter safety lights, which cast the planted borders in flat shadow and left the pavement in a pale yellow that made everything look slightly wrong. The 2 figures were across the courtyard, near the maintenance gate in the far wall, and Dana slowed to a walk because running directly at them was not useful, and she needed to see the situation before she entered it. The figure that was not a patient was a man in a dark overcoat who stood with the posture of someone accustomed to rooms where everyone adjusted to his presence. Late 60s, she estimated. White-haired, heavy through the shoulders in a way that suggested the coat was doing work. He had one hand on the arm of the woman beside him. Not gripping, guiding, which was a particular kind of control that looked like assistance until you understood the context. And he was speaking to her in a low, even tone. The woman, Mara Reese, presumably, was in a hospital gown and a cardigan that she'd pulled tight, and she was not looking at the man. She was looking at the gate. Dana walked toward them. She was 15 feet away when the man looked up and saw her. Admiral Desmond Farr. She put the name to the face and the face to the file photo Lund's page had carried, adjusted for 6 additional years, and the specific look of a person who has spent a long time being in charge of things. He did not look afraid. He looked like someone who was solving a problem, and the problem had just added a variable. "Stop there," he said. His voice had the trained projection of someone who had given commands in large rooms for 30 years. She stopped. Not because he told her to, but because Mara Reese was still within his grip, and the maintenance gate was 6 feet behind them, and she did not know what was on the other side of it. "You're not police," Farr said, assessing her scrubs with a glance. "No." "Hospital staff." "Yes." He looked at her with an expression that was almost courteous. "Then you should go back inside. This doesn't involve you." "It involves her," Dana said, looking at Mara Reese. Mara was in her early 50s, with dark hair going gray that had been cut unevenly, the way hair gets when someone else cuts it without much investment in the result. Her face was hollowed out in a particular way. Not illness, not age, but the specific erosion of prolonged confinement. She had the look of someone who had been inside long enough that outside had become theoretical, but she was looking at Dana now, not the gate. "Ms. Reese," Dana said, "I'm a nurse. You don't have to go anywhere with him." Mara said nothing. Farr's hand tightened on her arm, barely perceptible, but Dana caught it. "Mara has been under significant psychiatric stress," Farr said, with the smooth delivery of a man who had told this particular story many times. "She needs rest and consistent care, not—" "The psychiatric hold is fraudulent," Dana said. "It was filed under documentation you authorized. We have the records." Something moved in Farr's face. Very small. She marked it. "You're making serious allegations," he said. "I'm describing what's on a federal server as of about 20 minutes ago," she said. 43 files under a PHX-7 designation. Authorization trails. The connection to Alton Reese's records. She kept her voice even, factual, the way she'd learned to present clinical information to people who didn't want to hear it. "The people you sent here tonight have been detained. Marcus Vell is in the server room downstairs. Reed Harrison is in federal protective custody." She paused. "Miles Voran is on the 4th floor." Farr went still. It was the name that did it. The other things he'd been calculating against, the files, Vell, Harrison, those he'd had contingencies for. But Voran was a variable he'd believed was closed. "Voran is dead," he said. "He's bradycardic and he has a dislocated shoulder," Dana said. "But he's alive and he's been building a case file for 4 months and he has your authorization chain for the materials movement going back to the original network construction." She watched him. "The protective cover you put on his death record was breached 8 months ago. He's been working from inside it ever since." Farr looked at her for a long moment. She could see him going through it. The variables, the contingencies, the places where the story could still hold together. And she could see the moment he reached the edge of the spreadsheet and found it blank. His hand dropped from Mara Reese's arm. Mara stepped sideways. 1 step, then 2, putting space between herself and him with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been waiting for the geometry to shift for a very long time. She didn't run. She just moved until she was no longer within his reach. And then she stopped and looked at Dana with an expression that was not quite relief, because relief implied the thing was over, and she was not sure yet that it was. "Come with me," Dana said to her quietly. Mara Reese looked at Farr. He was standing very still in the courtyard in his dark overcoat with the yellow perimeter light on him, and he looked in that moment like what he actually was. A man in his late 60s who had spent years building something that was now comprehensively falling. who had come to a hospital courtyard in the middle of the night to silence a witness and who had been beaten there by a nurse in blue scrubs. He said nothing. Dana walked Mara back across the courtyard. They were 10 feet from the door when it opened and Lund came through with 2 officers behind him. He took in the scene, the courtyard, Farr standing at the far wall, Dana and Mara approaching, in about 2 seconds, and then he said something quietly to the officers, and they went past Dana toward Farr, and Lund met Dana at the door. "She needs a proper medical assessment," Dana said before he could speak. "Not a psychiatric evaluation routed through this hospital's system. Independent assessment, independent physician. The documentation in her file was generated to hold her, not to treat her." "Understood," Lund said. "And I want someone with her who isn't DIA," Dana said. "Tonight, right now, someone she chooses." Lund looked at Mara Reese. Mara was looking at the ground, arms wrapped around herself, still in the cardigan that was insufficient for the temperature. She was shaking slightly, which Dana had been tracking. Not hypothermic, not in crisis, but coming down from 2 years of sustained pressure in a body that hadn't been outside at night in a very long time. "Is there someone?" Lund asked her. Mara looked up. Her voice, when it came, was rougher than her appearance suggested. The voice of someone who hadn't spoken freely in a long while. "My sister," she said. "Carla. She's been trying to find me." "We'll find her tonight," Lund said. Dana took off her scrub jacket, the outer layer, the navy one she wore over the blue, and put it around Mara's shoulders. It was a practical gesture, not a tender one, but Mara pulled it around herself with both hands and held it closed and didn't say anything, which was enough. Behind them, across the courtyard, she heard Desmond Farr being informed of his rights. She didn't watch. She kept her eyes on the door. The next 3 hours were the kind that didn't have a shape until later. They were just movement and voices and the gradual grinding process of a building coming back to itself after something it hadn't been designed for. Federal agents arrived at 1:15, 8 of them in 2 vehicles, and the nature of the activity in Mercy Hollow General shifted in the way it does when a situation transfers from local jurisdiction to federal. Quieter, more deliberate, with a paper trail being assembled in real time by people whose job was specifically to build paper trails. Dana gave her statement twice, once to a local detective who wrote quickly and asked good questions, and once to a federal agent named Surya Bank, who was methodical and thorough and who paused at the part about the PHX-7 file transfer and said carefully, "You accessed the server room using a clinical credential?" "The access permissions had been over-assigned during a system upgrade," Dana said. "I reported the discrepancy 3 weeks ago." Bank looked at her over the notepad. "To IT." "To the IT liaison, yes. And it wasn't corrected?" "No." Bank wrote something. Dana couldn't read it upside down and didn't try. "The files you transferred, 43 records, PHX-7 designation, those have been secured at the federal level. They constitute material evidence in an ongoing investigation." She paused. "You're aware that your access to and handling of those records may be subject to review." "I'm aware," Dana said. "I accessed patient records in the course of protecting a patient and hospital staff. If that review results in a conversation, I'll have it." Bank studied her for a moment. "Who trained you to do a posterior shoulder reduction under field conditions?" "I've had a lot of continuing education," Dana said. Bank did not press it. She moved on to the next question. Reed Harrison was transferred at 2 a.m. to a facility she wasn't told the name of, in the company of 3 federal agents and a trauma surgeon who had been called in from off-site, which meant someone at the federal level had decided his wound needed to be managed outside Mercy Hollow's infrastructure. Dana checked his dressing one last time before they moved him, changed the outer layer, reconfirmed the IV. He looked at her while she worked. "You uploaded a copy before you gave me the drive," he said. "Yes." "You didn't tell me you'd done it." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I would have argued. That's why I didn't tell you, saw?" She taped the dressing. "You're going to need the shoulder looked at by someone with imaging equipment. The field dressing is holding, but there's tissue damage I can't fully assess without an MRI." "I know." He paused. "Thank you." She stepped back. "Don't thank me. You built the case. Get some sleep." He was taken out through the ambulance bay, and she watched the doors close, and then she stood in the corridor for 30 seconds doing nothing, which was the first 30 seconds in 4 hours she had done nothing, and she felt the evening settle into her body with the specific weight of things that had been running on adrenaline now presenting their invoice. Her knees ached. She hadn't noticed until now. She went back to the nurse's station on the main floor, where Patrice was sitting at the desk with a cup of coffee and the expression of a woman who had been through something and was not going to let it show more than it already had. "How are you?" Dana said. "I've had worse shifts," Patrice said, which was either true or a very good lie. She pushed a cup toward Dana. "There's more in the back." Dana took it and drank it standing up. It was bad coffee, the middle-of-the-night vending machine kind, with the slightly chemical edge of coffee that has been kept in a carafe too long. She drank all of it. "Tusk," she said, "out of the cath lab at midnight, stable. His daughter's with him." Patrice looked at her over the rim of her own cup. "The cardiologist left a note for the attending. Wants to know who flagged the presentation. I told him it was you." "What did he say?" "He said, 'Good catch,' and then he went home." Patrice set her cup down. "It was better than that, but he's not a man who overstates." Dana nodded. She looked at the census board, which had been updated in the chaos and corrected and was now running the way census boards run at 3 in the morning. A live record of the people in this building and what was happening to them. Entirely ordinary, entirely necessary. She thought about Mara Reese, who was in a room on the second floor now with a female officer outside the door and a promised phone call to her sister happening at this moment. She thought about Ordell, who had been checked by a paramedic and released and sent home at 1:30. She thought about Felix, the resident, who had done chest compressions on a stroke patient while armed men were in the building and who had not, as far as she could tell, done anything except exactly what was asked of him. She thought about Vel. Vel was in a different kind of custody than Farr, which meant he'd started talking before his lawyer arrived, which Banks had mentioned in passing with the neutral expression of someone who had seen this pattern before. People like Vel, people who had been recruited through vulnerability rather than ideology, tended to cooperate early because the story they'd been telling themselves collapsed faster. He had believed it was paperwork. He had believed nobody was getting hurt. And when the night showed him how wrong that was, the scaffolding came down quickly. It did not make what he'd done forgivable, but it made him useful, and in federal investigations, useful had a specific cash value that everyone understood. She was on her second cup of coffee, which was the same bad coffee because there was no other kind available, when Lund found her at the nurse's station at 3:40 a.m. He looked as tired as she felt, which made her feel marginally better about how she looked. He had his jacket off, shirt sleeves pushed up, the credential case gone from his breast pocket, because at this point, everyone who needed to know who he was already knew. "Farr's been transported," he said. "Federal holding. His attorney has been notified." He stood at the station counter and looked at the census board. The warrant for his communications came through at 2:40. We have 4 months of encrypted correspondence between him and the contractors. That plus Voron's archive plus the PHX-7 files. He let the weight of it sit in the air. It's substantial. Is it enough? For indictment, yes. For conviction? He tilted his head. Mara Reese's testimony, if she can give it, is what takes it from strong to airtight. Can she give it? Her sister's flying in from Portland. She'll be here by 6. He paused. The independent physician bank called in reviewed her file tonight. She has no psychiatric diagnosis that would hold up to independent review. The documentation was fabricated, co-signed by 2 physicians who've been identified as connected to the network. Dana thought about 26 months, about a woman in a hospital gown in a courtyard, arms wrapped around herself, shaking in the cold. "Who's Alton Reese?" she said. Lund was quiet for a moment. "Mara's husband. He worked here as a physician. He was the first coordinator Farr recruited at this facility. About 28 months ago, Reese decided he wanted out. He told Mara what he'd been part of. Farr found out." He looked at the counter. "Alton Reese died in a single-vehicle accident 26 months ago. The investigation closed as accidental." He didn't add anything to that. He didn't need to. Dana set her cup down. "His signature was on the false records," she said. "Used after his death by Vel, who was brought in as his replacement. Lund paused. Vel may not have known how Reese died. We don't know that yet. She stared at the census board. The names on it were patients, people who had come to this hospital for treatment, for help, for the specific transaction of handing their bodies over to people who were supposed to know what to do with them. It was a transaction built entirely on trust, and someone had been running a criminal network through the infrastructure of that trust for the better part of 2 years. The other 13 facilities, she said, were executing warrants simultaneously. Operations started at 3 a.m. Lund looked at his phone. 12 confirmed so far, 1 in progress. She nodded. The coffee was gone. She had nowhere to put her hands, so she put them flat on the counter. The staff here, she said, they don't know most of what happened tonight. They know there were armed men. They know there was an incident. They need to be told. Not everything, but enough. They were in this building. They deserve an explanation. That's going to be a managed disclosure, Lund said carefully. I know. I'm not asking for a press release. I'm asking for honesty with the people who work here. She looked at him. They came in tonight and did their jobs inside an active threat with no warning. Patrice held still with a gun at her head. Felix did compressions while armed men were in the building. Ordell held a door on a 3-knock signal from someone he barely knows. She kept her voice flat, not angry, just clear. They were not bystanders. They deserved to know why. Lund looked at her for a long moment. I'll see what I can do. Don't see. Do. His mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. You talk to senior DIA officers like that regularly? I talk to everyone like that, she said. It's a recent development. She left the nurse's station and walked the floor. The whole floor, all the way around, corridor by corridor. It was something she did at the end of difficult shifts, a habit she'd built in her first year that had nothing clinical to it, just the need to walk the space and see that it was intact, that the patients were in their rooms and the monitors were running and the unit was holding. It took 8 minutes. She did it slower than usual. She was coming around the last corridor back toward the station when she saw Felix Brace sitting on the floor outside the trauma bay with his back against the wall and his knees up and his head tilted back against the tiles. He was awake. His eyes were open and looking at the ceiling. She sat down beside him on the floor. Not because it was comfortable, the floor was hard and it was going to be harder to get up from than to get down to, but because it was where he was. He looked sideways at her. Is it over? Most of it, she said. What's the part that isn't over? Paperwork, she said. Testimony, trials. The part that takes years and happens somewhere else. He was quiet for a moment. Tusk's okay? Tusk's okay? I thought... He stopped, tried again. When Vel told you to let him go home, I thought about saying something. I didn't. She looked at the ceiling where he'd been looking. There was a water stain in the shape of nothing in particular near the light fixture. That's something to work on, she said. I know. You've got time. He put his head back against the wall. What did you do before this? Before nursing? I asked before and you didn't answer. I know I didn't. He waited. I did other things, she said, and then I decided I wanted to do this. Why nursing? She thought about it, which was something she didn't usually let herself do with that question. It always felt like the question had an expected answer, the calling answer, the vocation answer, the answer about caring and healing that sounded right and meant something but wasn't quite what was true. Because nurses are in the room, she said. They're there at every point. The doctors make decisions and leave. The nurses stay. She paused. I wanted to stay. Felix didn't say anything. After a while, he tilted his head toward her, not quite resting it on her shoulder, but close enough to be leaning, and she let him because he was 27 and had had a very long night and was going to be a good physician someday if someone in his training managed to keep the spine he was building. She was still sitting on the floor of the second-floor corridor of Mercy Hollow General at 4:12 a.m. when Lund appeared at the end of the hall and said, in a voice she'd learned to read quickly, Dana. She looked up. His face had the expression of someone who has received news that rearranges what he thought he knew. What? She said. He walked toward her, looked at Felix, and said to him, not unkindly, Can you give us a minute? Felix looked between them and then peeled himself off the floor with the efficiency of someone very tired who has decided to save his curiosity for later. He went around the corner and was gone. Lund sat down where Felix had been, which she hadn't expected and which told her the news was the kind that required proximity. Farr's attorney made contact with the federal holding facility at 4 a.m., Lund said. Standard initial contact. The attorney presented a sealed document along with the standard representation paperwork. She waited. The sealed document, Lund said, is a pre-negotiated cooperation agreement signed 8 months ago by a senior federal prosecutor. He paused. Before tonight happened. Before we had the PHX-7 files. Before Voron surfaced. She looked at him. Someone offered Farr a deal 8 months ago. Someone offered him immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony on a separate ongoing investigation. Lund's voice was carefully flat. The agreement was classified at the same level as cartilage itself. We didn't know about it. Voron didn't know about it. She felt the floor under her, which was solid and cold and very real. He's been cooperating with someone, she said. While running the network. While running it, yes. Lund looked at the ceiling. The prosecutor who signed the agreement is named Halloran. Arthur Halloran. He's based in the capital. We've been trying to reach him since 4 a.m. He stopped. She knew before he said it. Halloran's phone is going to voicemail, Lund said. His assistant says he left his office at 6:30 p.m. yesterday. He hasn't been seen since. The corridor was quiet. 4 a.m. quiet. The particular stillness of a hospital before the first shift change. When the building is at its lowest point between one day and the next. Farr wasn't just running the network, she said. No. He was feeding someone, she said, using the cooperation agreement as cover, someone above him, someone who needed the network to keep running and needed Farr protected in case it ever surfaced. That's what we think, yes. And the prosecutor was either part of it, Lund said, or found out about it. She looked at the wall across the corridor, a patient information board, visiting hours, emergency contacts, the kind of information that assumed a building that operated normally, that assumed a world where the structure held. The cooperation agreement, she said. Does it hold, legally? That, Lund said, is what 4 federal attorneys are currently arguing about in a conference room. He paused. But Farr's attorney is very good, and the agreement was properly executed. She thought about Mara Reese in a room on the 2nd floor, 26 months of her life spent inside a falsified psychiatric hold, waiting to give testimony that was supposed to matter. She thought about Alton Reese, who had tried to get out and had died in a car accident that was ruled accidental. She thought about what it meant that the agreement had been signed 8 months ago. 8 months ago, someone with federal prosecutorial authority had decided Desmond Farr was more useful protected than charged. He's going to walk, she said. Flat. Just the shape of it. Not necessarily, Lund said, but the word necessarily was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and they both heard it. She put her head back against the wall. The water stain near the light fixture was still there, still in the shape of nothing in particular. There's something else, Lund said. She looked at him. The cartilage file, he said. The original one. The one Voron was listed as deceased in. He looked at her steadily. We pulled the full access log tonight, going back to when someone first breached it 8 months ago. She waited. There were 2 access events, Lund said. The first one, 8 months ago, is the one we'd attributed to Farr's network, how they found out Voron was still running. And the second, Lund reached into his breast pocket and took out a folded paper. He held it out. She took it, unfolded it. It was a system access log, the kind that showed timestamp, credential used, terminal ID. The second access event was dated 3 weeks ago. The credential was a clinical staff ID issued by Mercy Hollow General Hospital. The terminal ID was a workstation in the nursing staff lounge on the 2nd floor. Her credential number. Her terminal. She looked at the page for a long time. Someone used your credentials to access the cartilage archive, Lund said quietly. 3 weeks ago. From inside this building. She looked up. I didn't do this, she said. I know, Lund said. And then, more carefully, but someone did. Someone who had access to your credential. Someone who wanted the file accessed under your name. He paused. Someone who wanted you in the middle of this before tonight ever happened. She looked at the access log again. 3 weeks ago. She'd been working days that week, which meant the staff lounge terminal would have been accessible on any shift without her present, which meant someone with time and opportunity and a reason to plant her name. Her phone, on the counter of the nurse's station she'd left it at, began to ring. She stood up and walked down the corridor and looked at the screen. Unknown number. She picked up. "Dana," said the voice on the other end. It was Miles Voron, not from the 4th floor. The quality was wrong for an internal call. It was a mobile connection, slightly compressed. Outside. "Why are you calling from outside the building?" she said. "Because I'm not in the building," he said. "I left through the service exit 20 minutes ago." She closed her eyes for 1 second. "Miles, there's something in the cartilage file I didn't tell Lund," he said. His voice was tight in a way that was not the shoulder, not the blood pressure, but something else. Something I've been sitting on for 4 months because I needed to be certain before I said it to anyone. She waited. "The person who built the network," Voron said. "The person above Farr. The person Farr was feeding information to while pretending to cooperate." He stopped, started again. "I know who it is." "Tell me," she said. "It's not someone I can say on an unsecured line," he said. "And it's not someone I can say inside a building with active DIA presence. Because if I'm right about who it is, there are people in that building tonight who report to them." The corridor was very still. "Where are you?" she said. "Parking structure. East side, 2nd level." He paused. "Come alone." She looked at the phone for 3 seconds after Voron ended the call. Come alone was the kind of instruction that meant something different depending on who gave it. From someone she didn't trust, it was a trap. From Miles Voron, who had faked his own death and spent 4 months building a case inside a classified archive with a dislocated shoulder and low blood pressure, it was a request from a man who understood exactly how exposed he was and was trying to control the one variable he still could. She put the phone in her pocket and went back to where Lund was still sitting on the corridor floor. "I need 20 minutes, she said. He looked up. The call was personal. He studied her face with the expression of a man who had made a career of reading people and was currently deciding how much he trusted what he saw. "Dana, 20 minutes, she said. "And I need you to pull the access log for the cartilage file, the full authentication trail on the second breach. Not just my credential, the terminal session, every keystroke timestamp." "Why?" "Because whoever used my credential had to know my login," she said. "Clinical passwords at this hospital are auto-generated and stored in one place, the nursing coordinator's access management system. I need to know who had access to that system 3 weeks ago." Lund was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Whatever else he was fast when information moved. She left him to it. The east parking structure was the same cold geometry it had been 3 hours ago, when she'd moved Harrison through it in the dark. Second level was half lit, mostly empty at 4:30 a.m., with 2 cars that had been here since before the incident and one that had arrived in the last hour and was parked near the stairwell with the engine off. Voron was leaning against the hood. He'd gotten himself a coat from somewhere, facilities probably, the kind of canvas work coat that hung on pegs in maintenance rooms. And his arm was still in the sling she'd fashioned, and he looked like what he was, a man who had pushed past what his body could reasonably sustain and was now managing the debt. She stopped in front of him. "You pulled out an IV to walk down here." It was a saline drip. "You're still hypovolemic." "I'm fine enough," he said, which was exactly what Harrison had said, and which was exactly as true. She let it go. "Tell me." He looked at the concrete floor, then up. "The network above Farr has one architect, not multiple. One. Someone who designed it from the beginning, who identified the hospital infrastructure weakness, who built the access codes into the federal exemption system so the materials movement could never be cleanly audited." He paused. "I spent 4 months looking for a pattern in the authorization chain, every node connected back to the same clearance tier, the same office." "Which office?" "The Office of Domestic Medical Infrastructure Oversight," he said. "It's a sub-office within HHS small, low visibility, about 30 staff. It exists to audit federal medical grant compliance, which means it has read access to billing systems across every federally funded hospital in the country. He looked at her. And it was created 11 years ago, under the tenure of its current director. She went still. The director's name is Elaine Farr, Veron said. She heard it and held it and turned it over. Farr's wife. Sister, Veron said. Desmond Farr is her brother. She built the framework. He ran the logistics. The cooperation agreement Farr signed 8 months ago, the one with the federal prosecutor Halloran, was initiated through Elaine's office using a procedural contact that bypassed the normal chain. He paused. She offered her brother's cooperation to Halloran in exchange for immunity, knowing that even if Farr was eventually charged, the immunity agreement would complicate prosecution long enough for her to close the network down quietly and retire the infrastructure. And Halloran. Halloran found out she was the architect 2 weeks ago, Voren said. He started pulling threads. His assistant told federal agents he'd been working late every night for the past week. He looked at her. Halloran isn't missing because he ran. He's missing because someone found out he knew. The parking structure hummed around them, the low electrical hum of lighting systems and ventilation that never fully stopped. Dana looked at the car parked near the stairwell, then back at Veron. Why couldn't you tell Lund this inside the building? She said. Because Lund's division reports through a chain that has 2 points of contact with Elaine Farr's office, Voren said. I don't know if Lund is dirty. I don't think he is. But I don't know who around him is, and I wasn't going to say her name in a room where it could travel up the wrong chain before we could contain it. She thought about Lund on the corridor floor, looking genuinely shaken by the cooperation agreement. She thought about the way he'd said, I know, when she'd told him she hadn't accessed the cartilage file. She thought about a man who had spent 12 minutes watching a siege from inside a building because he needed to know what he was working with, and who had, when it mattered, moved fast. He's not dirty, she said. You've known him 4 hours. I've known you for longer, and you lied to me for 6 years, she said, without heat. Just the fact of it. Veron absorbed that without deflecting it, which was the most honest thing he'd done since she walked into room 412. There's one more thing, he said. He reached into the coat pocket with his good hand and produced a phone. Not his, a burner, the prepaid kind, and held it out. 4 months ago, when I first identified the pattern, I made a copy of everything and routed it to a secure external server with a time lock. If I didn't re-authenticate every 72 hours, the files would auto-release to a journalist contact and 2 federal watchdog organizations simultaneously. He paused. I authenticated for the last time 3 days ago, before I came to Mercy Hollow. The next authentication window opens in 68 hours. She looked at the phone. You built a dead man's switch. I built insurance, he said, but I need someone to authenticate on my behalf if I'm in federal holding or under a security restriction when the window opens. She took the phone. The weight of it was nothing, a few ounces, but it was the weight of 14 months of Harrison's work and 4 months of Voron's, and the 43 records she'd pulled from a server room in a hospital basement, and the testimony of a woman who'd spent 26 months inside a falsified psychiatric hold. Give me Elaine Farr's name in a format I can hand to Lund in a way that protects you, she said. Write it down, sign it, date it. I want a paper record that came from you, not from me. He looked at her for a moment. Then he took the pen she'd had in her scrub pocket since the beginning of the shift, the one she hadn't used once, and wrote on the inside of the burner phone's packaging and signed his name and handed it to her. She folded it, put it in her pocket with the phone. Go back upstairs, she said. Get back in the bed. Let someone put the IV back in. Dana, Miles. She met his eyes. You've been running for 4 months on a case that should have had a team behind it. You reduced your shoulder falling down a ladder and then walked out of a hospital against medical advice at 4:30 in the morning to tell me something you could have told me in 30 minutes when the building was clearer. She paused. The work is done. Let someone else carry it for 10 minutes. He looked at her with the expression she remembered from 6 years ago, the one she'd never been able to fully read, that sat somewhere between assessment and something more personal that neither of them had ever had the operational space to name. You're different, he said, than you were. I stayed, she said. That changes you. She left him at the car and went back inside. Lund had the keystroke log when she found him. He was at the nurse's station with a laptop that hadn't been there before and the focused expression of a man who had found something he didn't want to have found. She put the burner phone packaging on the counter in front of him, Voron's handwriting facing up. He read it. He was very still for a long moment. How certain is he? 4 months of pattern analysis in a classified archive, she said. Certain enough to build a 72-hour dead man switch around. Lund picked up his phone, made a call, said 4 words into it, not to her, to whoever answered, and the 4 words were not dramatic, they were procedural, the kind of words that moved machinery. Then he hung up and looked at the keystroke log. The second cartilage breach, he said. The credential used was yours, but the authentication sequence ran 11 seconds faster than the average completion time for your previous logins. He turned the laptop toward her. 11 seconds is significant if you're unfamiliar with the interface. If you're familiar, your completion time would be consistent. He paused. The person who used your credential had never logged into this system before. Who had access to the nursing coordinator's password management, she said. 2 people, Lund said. The nursing coordinator herself, a woman named Yvette Prahl, 20 years at this hospital, currently home asleep, and by all accounts not involved in anything. And the physician who co-signed the system's onboarding documentation when it was installed 18 months ago. She waited. Marcus Vell, Lund said. She looked at the ceiling. The pieces had been there since the beginning. Vell, who had unlimited access to the hospital's administrative systems, who had known she was flagging patients and questioning protocols, who had been recruited 22 months ago and would have had every reason 3 weeks ago to know her name needed to be somewhere it could be used. He planted my credential in the cartilage file, she said. So if the network ever surfaced, there was a thread pointing to me. It's what we think, yes. Lund closed the laptop. He's already talking. When Banks shows him this, he'll talk about this too. She thought about that. About Vell in the server room, sitting on the floor with his face in his hands, the performance of his authority completely gone. He had not been the architect. He had been a man with a weakness who had made a series of decisions that had gotten progressively harder to reverse, the way those things always go. A small yes, and then a slightly larger yes. And then one day you're in a hospital basement, showing a phone screen to an armed man at midnight, and you have stopped being able to see the distance between who you started as and who you became. That didn't make her feel better about what he'd done, but it was true, and she believed in being precise about what was true. The cooperation agreement, she said, FAR's immunity. Attorneys are arguing, Lund said, but here's the thing about immunity agreements. They're predicated on the cooperation being honest. If FAR withheld the existence of Elaine's role, which the structure of his cooperation clearly indicates he did, the agreement has a material fraud clause that voids it. He paused. It's not guaranteed, but the argument is there. Make sure the right attorneys are making it, she said. I intend to. She looked at the census board. 5:15 a.m. The board had been updated. Tusk in cardiac recovery, status stable. Harrison's name had been removed, transferred. Mara Reese was still listed on the second floor with a note that read, consult pending. She thought about what pending meant for a woman who'd been inside this building for 26 months. It meant still waiting. It meant the work of getting out was not the same as being out. She went to the second floor. The officer outside room 207 let her in without argument. Inside, Mara Reese was sitting up in the bed, not sleeping, with a hospital blanket around her shoulders and her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had probably gone cold. She looked up when Dana came in. Your sister is on her way, Dana said. Mara nodded. She'd had a shower. Dana could tell from the damp edges of her hair. And someone had found her a clean set of clothes, and the difference between her now and the woman in the courtyard in the cardigan was the difference between a person who has stopped being managed and a person who is remembering what it feels like to make small choices. What to wear. When to sit up. How long? Mara said. Carla lands at 6:10, Dana said. 45 minutes. I meant... Mara stopped, looked at her hands. How long before I can leave? That's for the independent physician to determine, Dana said. based on your actual health, not fabricated documentation. I think it won't take long." She paused. "Your testimony. A federal attorney will want to speak with you about the timeline when you're ready, not before." Mara looked up at her. "I've been ready for 2 years," she said. "I've had nothing to do for 2 years except be ready." Dana sat in the chair beside the bed. She didn't have the right words for what this woman had been through, so she didn't reach for them. She just sat. After a while, Mara said, "I used to work in healthcare. Before." She said before the way people say it when the word has a specific wall built into it. "I was a hospital administrator, 20 years. "Where?" "Portland. 3 facilities. I understood billing systems, grant compliance, the whole infrastructure." She looked at her hands again. "That's how Alton knew. That's what he told me when he told me everything. He said Elaine Farr had built it so that anyone who understood the actual compliance framework would recognize what they were looking at. He said the only reason it worked was because most administrators don't look closely enough." Dana thought about what it meant that Mara Reese, with 20 years in hospital administration, had been sitting in a psychiatric unit for 26 months while the system she understood was used against her. "You're going to testify," Dana said. "Every word I know," Mara said. Dana looked at her. The straight back, the steady hands around the cold cup, the eyes that had the particular clarity of someone who has been waiting for something to matter and has just been told that it does. She left her to the waiting and went back to work. The morning happened the way mornings do after nights that have broken something, slowly and with the specific texture of people who are doing necessary tasks while carrying the weight of what they've been through. The day shift arrived at 6:30 and was briefed, and the briefing was imperfect and incomplete and somewhat chaotic because there was no clean way to explain the night to people who hadn't been in it, and nobody tried to make it clean. Patrice was still there at 6:45, which was 90 minutes past her shift end. She stood at the nurse's station and briefed the incoming charge nurse with the systematic precision of a woman who was not going to let exhaustion make her imprecise. When she was done, she took her bag from under the desk and put on her coat. And on her way out, she stopped beside Dana, who was finishing a medication log she'd started at midnight and never completed. "Good shift," Patrice said. Dry. The understatement of it was enormous. "Yeah," Dana said. Patrice put her hand on Dana's shoulder for exactly 2 seconds. Not a pat, a press. Deliberate, solid. Then she took her hand back and left. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. Over the following weeks, the shape of the night became clearer as the parts that had been classified were gradually, selectively unsealed. Elaine Farr was arrested at her office at 7:15 on the morning after, which was 11 hours after Dana had put Voron's handwriting on Loon's counter. The arrest was quiet in the way of federal arrests. No press at the scene, no footage, just a woman in a tailored jacket being walked to a car, but it did not stay quiet. Nothing that large stays quiet. Desmond Farr's immunity agreement was voided within the week. The material fraud clause held once 3 federal attorneys spent 72 hours pulling the cooperation record apart and demonstrating what Farr had withheld. He was charged with racketeering, conspiracy, and accessory to the circumstances surrounding Alton Reese's death, which was reclassified from accidental to under investigation within 10 days of Mara Reese's testimony. The investigation into Reese's death was not fast, and it was not clean, and it did not resolve in a way that gave anyone the particular satisfaction of a closed case. It resolved in the way of something that had been buried for 2 years and had to be carefully exhumed piece by piece with the knowledge that some parts of it would remain uncertain. But charges were filed. That was not nothing. Marcus Vell lost his medical license in March. The board proceeding lasted 2 days. He had cooperated fully with federal investigators, had given them everything, including the credential access log and the instruction he'd received from Farr's network to plant Dana's name, and the cooperation reduced his criminal exposure substantially, but it did not save his license because the board's review was separate from the federal case and the standard it applied was different. At the hearing, Dana was asked to provide a statement. She said he had been a poor physician before he was a criminal and that the two things were not unrelated. She said it clearly and without satisfaction because she was not interested in performing a verdict she already held. The 14 hospitals were audited. The PHX-7 records held up across 12 of them. The materials movement network was mapped, seized, and shut down. The process generated enough paperwork to fill rooms, which it literally did. There were proceedings she was told she might be called for that were not scheduled for another year. Mara Reese left Mercy Hollow General 8 days after the night had ended. She left with her sister Carla, who had arrived at 6:17 that first morning and had not left her side for 2 days, and she left wearing her own clothes for the first time in 26 months, and she did not look back at the building when she walked out. Dana was not there to see it. She heard about it from Bev, who had been the one to walk her to the exit, and who told it matter-of-factly, without decoration, the way Bev told most things. Voren was debriefed for 6 weeks by a federal oversight team that did not include anyone from Lund's division, which had been Lund's own recommendation, made in writing, and which was one of the things Dana revised her assessment of him for. He would not face charges. The work he'd done inside the restricted archive had been unauthorized, but the case it built was too substantial for anyone to prosecute the method seriously, and the federal prosecutor assigned to the oversight review had a different word for what he'd done: necessary. At some point in November, a letter arrived at Mercy Hollow's Nursing Administration office. It came from the Office of Federal Healthcare Compliance and was addressed to the nursing staff of Mercy Hollow General. And it contained the kind of formal language that official documents contain, which is to say it was not moving to read. What it said, in the center of all that language, was that the nursing staff's actions on the night of the incident had been instrumental in the preservation of federal evidence and the protection of civilian lives, and that the director of the office wished to formally recognize the contributions of the staff, and specifically of the nurse whose independent clinical actions had initiated the chain of events that led to the network's exposure. It named her Dana Kelso, RN, in a federal document with a case number attached. She read it once, standing at the nurse's station on a Wednesday afternoon between a medication check and a patient consult, and she folded it and put it in her locker and went back to work. Patrice found it in there 2 days later while looking for the stapler she'd lent Dana in September. "This is in your locker," Patrice said, holding it up. "I know. It's a federal commendation." "I know what it is." Patrice looked at her with an expression that had traveled through exasperated and arrived at something more complicated. "You're going to put this back in your locker." "I was going to take it home eventually," Dana said. "I've been busy." Patrice held on to it for a moment longer. She looked at the letter and then at Dana, and her face did the thing it did when she was deciding how much to say and settling on less than she felt. "You know what the worst part of that night was for me," Patrice said. Dana waited. "Not the gun," Patrice said. "It was the hour before, when Vel told you to release Tusk, and I heard him, and I let it happen. I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I stood there, and I let it happen." She folded the letter carefully along its original crease. "You didn't. You were following protocol," Dana said. "I was following him," Patrice said. "There's a difference." She held the letter out. "Take it home. Put it somewhere you can see it. Not because you need the reminder, because the people who come after you need to know that it's possible." Dana took the letter. She thought about what Patrice had said and what it meant. And she thought about Felix Bray, who had been much better in the 2 months since, who had learned something that night about the cost of standing still when you already know what's wrong. She thought about Ordell, who had gone home and come back the next day and had told her very simply that he trusted her and wanted her to know it. She thought about what it had taken to be trusted by the people in this building, not the federal document, not the case number, not the commendation. The 2-second press of Patrice's hand on her shoulder, the way Felix leaned slightly toward her in the corridor at 4 a.m., the way the incoming charge nurse on the morning after had said, almost in passing, "I heard you were here last night," with a tone that meant something specific. Trust was built in the room. It was built over time, in small increments, by being the person who stayed when others could have left, by being the person who said the difficult thing clearly, by being the person who checked the patient's pulse when the monitor was saying one thing and the patient's face was saying another. She had come to Mercy Hollow General as a person trying to be ordinary. She had wanted the ordinary weight of a shift, the ordinary difficulty of difficult work, the ordinary rhythm of a life that did not require her to be anything other than present and skilled and careful. She had wanted to stay. She had stayed. And the staying had made her visible in a way she hadn't planned for, and the visibility had cost something, and the cost had been worth it. Not because of the letter or the case number, but because Arnie Tusk was in cardiac rehab and Mara Reese was in Portland with her sister, and a woman who had run a criminal network through federal medical infrastructure was sitting in a holding facility waiting for trial. None of those outcomes were clean. None of them were complete. Tusk still had heart disease and a difficult few months ahead of him. Mara Reese still had 2 years to rebuild from. The trials would take time and the verdicts were not guaranteed, and the system that had allowed it to happen was still the system and would need to be fixed by people working inside it, slowly, in the ordinary way that hard things get fixed. But the night had happened, and she had been there for it, and she had not looked away from what she could see. She took the letter home that evening, after a shift that was exactly as hard as shifts always are. One patient who deteriorated faster than expected, one family that needed more than she had time to give them, one medication error caught at the last check that made her stomach drop, one small moment at the end where a woman who had been in a lot of pain all day looked at her and said thank you, in a way that was not about gratitude for a specific procedure, but about something more general and harder to name. She put the letter on her kitchen table. She made coffee that was better than the hospital's, which was not a high bar, and she sat down, and she looked at her name on a federal document, and she thought about what it meant to be seen. Not famous, not celebrated, not made into something larger than she was, just seen, accurately, specifically, for what she had actually done, by people who had the power to have continued not seeing her and had chosen not to. It was not the same as justice, but it was part of the same thing. She drank her coffee. Outside, the city was doing what cities do, moving, indifferent, full of its own weight and weather. Somewhere in it, people were in hospitals. Some of them were being looked after by people who saw them clearly. Some of them were not. That gap, between being looked at and being seen, between being managed and being cared for, was the gap that mattered, and it was filled or left empty one shift at a time, one decision at a time, by people who had the choice to stay or to step back, and who made that choice without a letter or a case number to justify it. She had